I was setting the table when she walked in. It was one of those small, ordinary evenings that, in hindsight, feels almost staged. The kind of quiet Tuesday you don't bother to remember until you do. Chicken was in the oven, timer ticking down. 2 glasses of wine breathing on the counter. I'd even folded the cloth napkins, which I never do. I was trying, small things. Effort. We'd both been tired lately, caught up in work, in errands, in the sort of daily fog that settles in after a few years of marriage. I figured a simple dinner at home might clear some of that. I glanced at the clock again. She was 30 minutes late. No call. No text. I wasn't worried exactly. Just mildly irritated. That familiar, low-level kind of irritation that you don't quite voice because it feels petty. People run late. Traffic. Meetings. Life. Then the door opened, and there she was. The first thing I noticed was the dress. It was black. Simple but elegant. The kind of dress that clings without asking permission. I had never seen it before, and I know her wardrobe better than she thinks I do. It didn't say long day at the office. It didn't even say client dinner. It said something else entirely. It was the kind of dress you put on to be looked at. She paused in the doorway, like she'd forgotten which house she was walking into. Then, as if correcting herself, she smiled and said, "Hey, smells good in here." "Just roasted chicken," I said. "You're late." She shrugged and walked past me into the kitchen, her heels clicking softly on the wood floor. "Yeah, sorry. Lost track of time." Her tone was breezy, but her movements were tight. Rehearsed. She poured herself a glass of wine, then glanced down at her phone like it had just buzzed, though I hadn't heard a thing. I walked over and kissed her cheek. Her skin was cool, like she'd just stepped out of air conditioning. And she smelled different, not unpleasant, just not her usual scent. Floral, sharp, fresh, new. "Perfume?" I asked, stepping back slightly. She hesitated, just for a second too long. "Oh, yeah, sample I got at work. Figured I'd try it out." It didn't sound like a lie. Not exactly, but it didn't land like the truth either. I nodded, and she sipped her wine quickly, almost gratefully. "Long day?" I asked. "The usual," she said. Then, like she was suddenly aware of the dress she had on, she added, "I'm gonna go change. Be right back." She moved fast, almost like she didn't want to give me a chance to say anything else. I watched her head down the hall toward the bedroom, her back straight, the hem of that dress swaying just slightly with each step. I followed casually, told myself I just wanted to grab a sweater from the hall closet. I didn't need a sweater, but I hovered quiet outside the bedroom door. It was open just an inch. I could see her back reflected in the full-length mirror across from the bed. She was slipping the dress off her shoulders, letting it fall in one smooth motion down her body. And there was nothing underneath. No straps, no lines, no lace, just bare skin. She stepped out of the dress like she was used to doing it for someone else. She didn't rush. She didn't tiptoe. She didn't even look around. She thought she was alone, and maybe she was. I backed away carefully, quietly, like a man retreating from a room that might explode if he breathed wrong. Back in the kitchen, I turned the oven off, stirred the vegetables that didn't need stirring, topped off my wine, and tried to remember if she'd ever worn that perfume before, or if she'd ever worn that expression before. That half-present look, like her body had come home, but her mind was still parked somewhere across town. She came back out in leggings and a hoodie, hair pulled into a messy bun. Comfortable. Familiar. Like slipping into an old version of herself. She smiled. "Smells amazing." "I'm starving." I smiled back. "Glad you're home." We ate. We talked. Nothing dramatic. She asked about my day, nodded in all the right places. I told a joke. She laughed. We cleaned up the dishes side by side like we always did. It was so normal, it was almost convincing. Almost. Later that night, after she fell asleep beside me, I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling. The perfume lingered on her skin, faint but distinct. The dress, I realized, had no tags on it. It wasn't brand new, just new to me. And when she undressed, there was a kind of ease in it. Muscle memory. a quiet fluency that had nothing to do with me. I didn't say anything that night, didn't ask questions, didn't accuse, because maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. Maybe the dress was for some forgotten work event, and maybe the perfume was just a sample, and maybe I was just tired and overthinking and creating shadows where there was only dust. But then again, maybe not, because I've lived with this woman for 10 years. I've seen her tired. I've seen her distracted. I've seen her overwhelmed, anxious, frustrated, joyful, exhausted. But that night, that was something else. That wasn't her being tired. That was her being careful. And it's the carefulness that stuck with me. Not the dress. Not the perfume. Not even the way she slipped under the covers like nothing had happened. It was the care. Like she was trying not to leave fingerprints. And when someone starts worrying about leaving fingerprints, well, there's usually a reason. I didn't have any confirmation yet, but the feeling that everything had changed was too clear to ignore. And soon I would be shown how much I had underestimated the truth. I didn't go looking for it. I wasn't snooping. I wasn't scrolling through her phone at midnight like some jealous teenager. It wasn't premeditated. It just happened. It was Saturday morning. She was making coffee in the kitchen, humming softly to herself. That same hum she's had since we first met. Off-key, tuneless, and oddly comforting. I was sitting on a couch, flipping through emails on my laptop. We had plans to drive upstate later in the afternoon. Just a weekend away. A little air. A little space. She had left her phone on the arm of the couch, screen up, still unlocked. She just responded to something before walking into the kitchen. I didn't think anything of it until the screen lit up again. One message, then another, and then a third. Not from a name I recognized. Just a number. No emoji. No pet names. Just 4 words that reached out of that little screen and grabbed me by the throat. Missed you today. Again. I stared at the words like they'd been written in a language I should understand, but suddenly didn't. The punctuation, the rhythm, the familiarity, they weren't casual. They weren't spam or mistaken identity. That message knew her life, knew where she was and where she wasn't. And more than that, it expected her. I didn't touch the phone at first. I just looked at it like it was a lit fuse. Then another message popped up. Next Friday? Your place. That did it. I picked it up. Hand steady, oddly enough. I wish I could say they were shaking, but they weren't. There was a calm that settled over me. An eerie stillness, like my body knew something my mind hadn't caught up with yet. I opened the thread. There they were. The digital fingerprints she thought she'd wiped clean. Weeks of messages. Dozens, maybe more. I didn't count. My eyes scanned fast, jumping over time stamps and awkward gaps in the conversation. There was nothing graphic. No confessions of love. No dramatic declarations. Just familiarity. Ease. Inside jokes I didn't understand. References to places I'd never heard her mention. Plans, carefully coded, but unmistakably intimate. Still thinking about that last time. You wore me out. Rain check on Wednesday. He's home all week. Black dress equals success. That one stopped me. Black dress. I set the phone down like it had burned me. She was still in the kitchen, pouring almond milk into her coffee, her back turned. Completely unaware. I sat there, staring straight ahead, my heart pounding a slow, hollow rhythm in my chest. The living room looked exactly the same as it had 5 minutes ago. Same light filtering through the blinds. Same throw pillows she always adjusted twice before sitting down. But something had shifted. The air felt heavier, thicker. I could still smell the perfume from Tuesday on one of her scarves draped over the armchair. Or maybe I imagined it. Funny how your senses betray you in moments like that. Suddenly everything is a clue. Every scent, every glance, every pause in conversation. She walked back into the room, coffee in hand, and sat down beside me. You okay? She asked, brushing a piece of hair behind her ear. I nodded. Yeah, just thinking. She smiled. About? I shrugged. Work stuff. She leaned her head on my shoulder, casual, like it was the most natural thing in the world. And maybe it used to be. Her body was warm against mine. Familiar. But now it felt like something borrowed. Something returned. Her phone buzzed on the table. She didn't check it. Just sipped her coffee and closed her eyes. I didn't move. Didn't say a word. I just sat there, inside the quiet collapse of something I hadn't realized was already falling. It's strange, the moment when suspicion hardens into knowledge. You'd think it would feel like a fire alarm, loud, chaotic, impossible to ignore. But for me, it felt more like the sound of the last suitcase zipping shut, like the click of a door quietly closing. I had proof now, but proof doesn't come with instructions. It doesn't tell you what to do with the look on your wife's face when she leans on your shoulder and closes her eyes, thinking she's safe. It doesn't explain how to sleep next to someone who's building a second life in between messages. It just sits with you, quiet and heavy, waiting. That night, she talked about the drive the next morning, where we should stop for lunch, whether we should take the scenic route or the highway. I nodded in all the right places. She fell asleep early, curled up under the blanket like she always did. I lay next to her, eyes open, the faint glow of her phone still on the dresser across the room. I didn't open the messages again. I didn't need to. I'd seen enough. The black dress, the perfume, the carefulness, and now this. What haunted me wasn't just the betrayal. It was the realization that she had been moving through our life like an actress in a play we both used to believe in, hitting her marks, saying her lines, all while glancing offstage to someone else, waiting in the wings. And me? I was still clapping after every scene. I saw her every day, and I knew that those eyes were no longer looking only at me. And one day I would make her look right into my soul. I waited. 3 days, to be exact. Long enough to be sure I wouldn't explode, short enough that the silence didn't turn me into someone I didn't recognize. I've never been a man who yells. I was raised by a father who believed in quiet strength, and a mother who believed in thinking before speaking. So I did both. I thought. I watched. I waited. She didn't notice. Or maybe she did. Maybe the sudden quiet was too familiar to her, like she'd rehearsed for it. We didn't go upstate after all. She claimed a last-minute work obligation, something she couldn't get out of. I nodded, said no problem. She kissed my cheek and disappeared for 5 hours. Came back with a bag from a cafe she never used to like. Her hair smelled different again. That night, I made dinner. Pasta, garlic bread, wine. She was in her usual spot at the table, scrolling through her phone, one leg tucked under her. Comfortable, at ease, like everything was still in place. I sat across from her. Didn't eat. She didn't notice at first. She was laughing at something on her screen. Then I placed my phone on the table, face up. The screen was black for a moment. Then, like clockwork, a notification lit it up. A screenshot. Her words. Next Friday? Your place. She looked at it, then at me. Her mouth opened, then closed again. I watched her jaw tighten, just slightly. Who is he? I asked. My voice was level, not raised. No edge, just flat, like a man reading off a checklist. She blinked. What? I leaned back. I read the messages. I didn't go looking, but they were there. And I read them. So who is he? She stared at the screen. A pause. Too long. Then, finally, it's nothing. I nodded slowly, eyes on her. You wore a black dress to see him. That wasn't nothing. She looked away. It's not serious. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the phrase was so bizarrely out of place. Not serious. Like she was talking about a movie she watched once and didn't care for. Was it just once? I asked. Silence. That was the first real answer she gave me. I stood up, walked over to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water. I didn't trust my hands with the wine. From the corner of my eye, I could see her staring at her lap like the table no longer mattered. I trusted you, I said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. I didn't expect perfection. I just expected honesty. She rubbed her forehead. I didn't mean for it to happen. I didn't plan it. They never do, I said quietly. She looked up, and for a second I saw something real in her eyes, maybe guilt, maybe panic. I was lonely, she said. You were always working. You stopped noticing me. I nodded. So instead of telling me that, you found someone who did. It wasn't like that. I looked at her. Then tell me what it was like. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. It was just someone to talk to. At first, and later, I asked. She didn't answer. That was the second answer. I walked back to the table and sat down across from her. I need you to leave. Her eyes widened. What? I'm not screaming. I'm not throwing anything. But I can't sit across from you and pretend this didn't happen. So I need you to go. She stood up, hands shaking slightly. You're seriously kicking me out? Just like that. I looked at her, and in that moment I realized how tired I was. Not angry, not hurt in the way she might have imagined. Just deeply, fundamentally tired. You already left, I said. I'm just catching up. That landed. I could see it hit her. She stood there, looking at me like maybe she didn't recognize me anymore. Or maybe she was just seeing me clearly for the first time in months. Her mouth moved like she wanted to say something, but the words didn't come. She grabbed her purse and her keys, hesitated by the door. I didn't mean to hurt you, she said. I nodded. You just didn't mean not to. She left without another word. The door closed quietly behind her. No slam, no dramatics, just a soft click. I sat back down at the table. Her half-eaten plate of pasta was still there, the fork resting gently on the rim of the bowl. The wine was untouched. The house was quiet. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't pretending. When she left, I didn't feel any relief. Only an echo. And there were questions I didn't want to hear. The house was quieter without her. Not silent, just quiet in a way I hadn't noticed before. Less perfume in the air. Fewer text alerts. No soft footfalls in the morning. No sound of her humming in the kitchen while the kettle boiled. Funny thing is, I used to crave that quiet. When work was overwhelming or life felt too crowded, I'd sit in this very living room and think, I just need a little peace. Now I had it, and it didn't feel like peace. It felt like space. Too much space. The first morning after she left, I made coffee for two out of habit. Poured hers into the blue mug she always used, the one with the tiny chip on the rim she never seemed to mind. I stood there staring at the steam rising from the cup, then poured it down the sink. Day 2, I slept in. Didn't shave. Ate cold leftovers for breakfast, and let the dishes pile up. I wasn't grieving, not exactly. More like adjusting, recalibrating, walking through the house like a man learning to breathe underwater. I kept expecting something, an apology, a follow-up conversation, some moment of reckoning. But nothing came. She didn't call, didn't text, didn't come back for her things. So, on day 4, I packed them myself. I started with the bathroom. Her drawer still held her makeup, her hair ties, that ridiculous jade roller she swore made a difference. I placed everything neatly in a box. No anger, just sorting, clearing, making room. Then the closet. Her clothes still smelled like her. I didn't lean in for the scent, but it was there, involuntary, unavoidable. That faint combination of detergent, skin, and memory. I folded each piece carefully. Not out of sentimentality, just respect. You can end something with dignity, or you can burn to the ground. I had no interest in fire. I hesitated on her favorite sweater. The mustard yellow one she always wore on rainy Sundays. Sleeves too long, neck stretched from years of use. I set it aside. Couldn't explain why. Maybe because it didn't look like something you'd wear to meet a man behind your husband's back. It looked like her, or who she used to be. I left it folded on the bed. Later that night, I sat on the couch, a box of her shoes beside me, flipping through a photo album I hadn't touched in years. Our honeymoon in Maine, a road trip to Asheville, one shot of us laughing in a diner booth, mid-conversation. I couldn't remember what we were talking about. That bothered me more than I expected. I kept asking myself, was it always broken? Or did it snap all at once? The truth is, we had drifted. No question about that. But most couples drift. The difference is some fight the tide. Others lean into it, pretending the current is something they chose. We were good at pretending. Looking back, I can see it How the conversations got shorter, how the silences stretched longer. How the little touches, her hand on my back, my kiss on her shoulder before bed, gradually stopped showing up. And yet I stayed. Not because I was blind, but because I believed. I believed in her. In us. I thought the foundation was solid, even if the walls needed paint. Turns out the cracks ran deeper. What caught me off guard wasn't the affair itself. It was the ease of it. How quietly she carried it. How seamlessly she wove it into our life. Like threading a second life through the seams of the first. That's the part one keep coming back to. Not the betrayal. The effortlessness of it. Still, I don't hate her. I wish I could say I did. It would make things simpler. But the truth is, hate takes energy. And I've already given this enough. What I feel now is quieter. Sadness, mostly. Not just for what happened, but for what we lost. For the version of us that once existed and, for a little while, felt untouchable. The next weekend, I opened the windows, cleaned the kitchen, took the throw pillows she bought, and stuffed them in the closet. Not out of spite, just to see what the room looked like without her fingerprints. It looked unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. That night, I lit a candle, turned on a record, sat with a book, and didn't read a word. I was alone, yes, but I wasn't lost. There's something freeing about facing the truth, even when it breaks you. Especially when it breaks you. Because once the pieces are on the floor, you can stop pretending you were whole in the first place. The future? Still hazy. I don't have a 5-year plan. I don't know what comes next, but I know what doesn't. And that's a start. The next morning, I saw her sweater still folded on the bed. I picked it up, pressed it to my chest, then gently laid it in the final box. Maybe I'm ready to let go. Maybe not, but I'm facing forward now, and that counts for something. I was almost used to being alone when the past came knocking again, but this time, I didn't open it right away. Healing doesn't come with a finish line. There's no banner that says, you've moved on. No loud applause when you finally sleep through the night or go a full day without thinking about what happened. It's quieter than that. Slower. You don't realize it's happening until one day. You're halfway through your morning coffee and you notice it tastes good again. It started with small things. The locks were the first. Not out of paranoia, just a quiet declaration that this space belonged to me now. A locksmith came by on a rainy Thursday. He worked quickly, chatting about nothing while I stood in the hallway holding a warm mug and pretending it was just another Thursday. After that came the bank. A visit to the credit union. Some paperwork, a polite woman in a navy blouse asking me, joint or individual? Individual, I said. Definitely individual. Then, the lawyer. A friend recommended someone, straightforward, no-nonsense kind. She walked me through everything. The process wasn't easy, but it was clear. I signed the papers with a steady hand. No ceremony, no bitterness, just a quiet step forward. My evening shifted, too. I started going on walks again, the kind I used to take before life got busy and marriage got quiet. I dusted off my old guitar from the hall closet, fingers clumsy at first, then gradually finding their way again. I called people I hadn't talked to in too long, friends I'd unconsciously drifted from while wrapped up in my Wii. Turns out they were still there, willing to meet for coffee, willing to sit across from me and talk about real things, books, baseball, heartache, starting over. I laughed sometimes, the kind of laugh that catches you off guard because you didn't think it was still in you. The house changed, too, not dramatically. I didn't redecorate or burn old photos. But little by little, it became mine again. Her boxes were gone. Her scent faded. I rearranged the bookshelves, replaced the old curtains, moved the armchair into the corner where the light hits in the late afternoon. That corner became my favorite spot. And then, one afternoon, she came back. No warning. Just a text. Stopping by to get the rest of my things. Won't be long. She didn't ask. Just informed. I stood by the window when her car pulled up. She wasn't alone. A man got out with her. Tall, younger than me by a few years. Clean cut, decent posture. The kind of man who didn't look like a villain, didn't look like anything, really. Just a face. They didn't come to the door. She had a key. I hadn't changed the back one yet. I stayed in the front room, heard the soft thud of boxes being carried, drawers opening and closing, quiet words exchanged between them. They were careful not to linger. In and out. 30 minutes, maybe less. As she walked toward the car, she paused in the driveway and looked back, just for a moment. Maybe she was expecting me to appear at the door. Maybe she wanted me to. But I didn't move. Not out of pride. Not out of spite. I just didn't need to. She got in the car. They drove away. I didn't feel triumph or heartbreak. I just felt still. Later that evening, I met my friend Tom for dinner. He'd gone through something similar years back. Different story, same fracture. We sat outside a little Italian place we used to haunt in our 20s. Talked like no time had passed. Halfway through the meal, he said, "You look lighter." I nodded. "I think I am." We laughed. Real laughter. The kind that comes from somewhere below your ribs. Walking home. The night was cool, the streets soft with spring air. I passed a couple holding hands, young and unaware. I didn't envy them. I didn't mourn them. I just noticed them. Like a painting in a gallery you once loved, now viewed from a quiet distance. When I reached my block, I paused at the corner. The porch light was on. The house looked different now. Less like a chapter closed, more like a blank page waiting. There were no ghosts in the windows. No echoes in the halls. Just space. Air. Possibility. I stood there a moment longer, then stepped inside. Set my keys on the table. Exhaled. I was free. Not in the cinematic, trumpet-blaring sense. Just in the way that mattered. I wasn't carrying her anymore. Or the questions. Or the weight. She had her path now. And I had mine. I didn't know exactly where it would lead. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of the next step. And that, I realized, is what healing feels like. Not forgetting. Not pretending it didn't hurt. Just walking forward anyway.